So where is the common ground to be found? Well, the reason I sort of chose this cover, on the cover of the Soul of Atlas, you see this very familiar picture of Atlas, the iron statue on Fifth Avenue and 50th Street in New York, that to me represents Ayn Rand's philosophy. And in juxtaposition to that is St. Patrick's Cathedral right across the street. It's as if they're in conversation. It's as if they're talking with one another, and yet they don't talk. That's my point. That's why I wrote this. But it's just they're in juxtaposition. Interestingly, the building in the top left is where I spent 3 years of my life working as an investor and an analyst. So happens to be a block away. But reconciliation and this conversation is going to look different for different people. But if we engage and try to truly understand, I think we can come to some kind of reconciliation. And I started to say, where is it that we find that? And 3 examples. So it starts with philosophical reconciliation. It starts with these worldviews share the foundation of the conviction of objective reality, objective truth. That humans have a capacity to reason, and that's essential to our identity and our capabilities. The world we live in presents itself to us in ways that are knowable and can be investigated. That's key. And I think that, let's just start there, and sort of also, I guess, in keeping with that meaning, there is meaning at the core of our experience as humans, and our political ideologies reflect that. I found common ground in politics, which, ironically, where no one finds common ground. I mean, and here I'm finding common ground between these 2 worldviews. Ayn Rand believed that the government has a role, but it's confined to defending individuals from criminals at home and abroad, not controlling the means of production, not distributing wealth. If you ask John, my stepfather, why he espouses this role for government, he would say that it's because it supports and encourages individual production, innovation, creation of value, and it supports the individual. If you ask Dad why he favors a limited government, he would say that the government is not the benefactor of the people. By overreaching, the government usurps the role of the church in society, the individuals who of their own choice seek to help others as Jesus did. The 2 fathers come to the same conclusion about limited government, but from very different foundations and through a very different reasoning process. On the front of economics, capitalism, if you ask John, why do you espouse capitalism? He'd say because it recognizes the need for man to produce value in order to sustain and enhance his own life as a rational being. If you ask Dad, he would say that capitalism is the only economic system that makes room for human beings being inherently selfish. Socialism depends on everyone being inherently altruistic, and when people prioritize themselves, their own interests over the collective in a socialist system, a totalitarian regime has to come in and keep things in line. I want to read to you out of earlier in Soul of Atlas. Dad and John agree about a lot. After the divorce, I doubt they conversed with each other about the trivialities of politics, but they definitely talked to me. As far back as I can remember, their voting record lined up perfectly. When my vote diverged from Dad's, it diverged from John's, and vice versa. The heat of politically charged debate among my family members was some of the hottest. The passion of these men set the conversation ablaze, but the embers came from a different source in each man's worldview. John's philosophy incorporates capitalism. For Dad, capitalism was not part of his philosophy. It simply made sense. Dad quoted scripture like he was referring to something he'd read that morning, which he probably had. He says, I quote him here, when Paul the Apostle said, all things are lawful, but Not everything is expedient. I don't think, says Dad, he was thinking of capitalism. But you could apply that evaluation to political systems. Capitalism is expedient. It's not necessary for Christianity to thrive, but it addresses some fundamentals that Christianity uniquely understands. As I conveyed Rand's thinking to Dad, he responded in agreement. Rand's arguments for capitalism make logical sense, he said. But she doesn't explain the reason such arguments must be made in the first place. If thinking in rational interest is appropriate to human survival, then why do men behave in any other way? The Bible explains that our separation from God has curtailed our reason, among other things. He chuckled before he said, "In my experience, people are not always rational and consistent." Dad pondered, "I think capitalism is the only system that makes room for this doctrine and doesn't depend on the kind-hearted benevolence of humanity." Rand predicted the current political and economic environment, what she would characterize as an epidemic of irrationality. Thinking, or reason, is an act of the will. Unlike the autonomic reflex of an animal's survival instinct, man has a different mode of survival. So why doesn't everyone fall in line with the thinking that is required for man's survival? I asked John. He answered without hesitation, bad philosophy. When people avoid what is in their rational self-interest, they reject capitalism because capitalism rewards you when you act in your rational self-interest. Socialism rewards you if you don't. What's more, socialism counts on people acting in each other's best interests, and that's just not what makes people tick. Not for me, at least. The logic of Christianity and capitalism became clearer to me. If people will naturally be self-centered and act according to what they believe will benefit themselves, then the best political and economic system is one which succeeds in that environment. The socialist system requires that each individual act out of selfless, altruistic motives. It sounds nice, but the only way that could happen is if man were innately centered on others. I agree with John. It doesn't hold true in real life any more than an Atlas Shrugged. So, reconciliation, as it turned out in my life, had as much to do with recognizing the limits to utter harmony as it did the areas of agreement. And you know, I came to see that in many ways these men and these worldviews and their values coincided. I just referenced a few of those a moment ago, but I go on in the book to discuss meaning and joy and even sex and selfishness. Those are all chapter titles. And where there's more alignment than is almost ever elucidated between Ayn Rand's thinking and Christianity.